Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one. One where we dive into tons of great middle grade novels and stories, and another where we just dive into tons of interesting topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, let's learn about the origin of transportation words. There's these hidden stories behind the words we use every day, and yes, you can go with every word in terms of the origins, and they go back to Greece, they go back to Asia, they go back to Rome. You name it, it's all over the word. Every word that we speak had a beginning, but there's plenty of interesting stories. So we're going to grab the etymology of each of these fun transportation words that we always say, but we don't stop and think about where they came from, where the word originated from. So it's fun, it's interesting, and it's surprising. Okay, let's learn. So we got 20 words I'm going to roll out, and we're going to rank them from 20 to 1. And the ranking is based on not how common they are, but how likely are you to say, I had no idea where that word came from, right? So let's begin. Number 20, glove compartment. Yeah, absolutely. And that's 20 because I never bothered to think about it, but I'm sure I can figure out where the word came from. Well, in the early days of automobiles, especially in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, cars were open to the weather. Drivers wore heavy leather gloves to protect their hands, obviously from the heat, the cold temperatures, you name it. Manufacturers began building a small storage compartment into the dashboard specifically for those gloves, and it naturally became known as the glove compartment. Today, no one keeps gloves in there, obviously, but, the name's stuck. How about the word car? Number 19. It's traveled through history for nearly 2,000 years. It comes from the Latin word carus, meaning a wheeled wagon or cart. The Romans borrowed the term from Celtic-speaking peoples who were famous for building sturdy wagons long before automobiles existed. For centuries, car referred to many different types of wheeled vehicles, including railroad cars, right? We forget that. When the automobile appeared in the late 1800s, people simply shortened the phrase motor car to just car, and the name stuck. Number 18, how about tire? Where'd that word come from? It's a little surprising because it probably had nothing to do with, obviously, the word tired, T-I-R-E-D. Most language historians believe the word came from the older English word attire, meaning to dress, equip, or cover something. Wooden wagon wheels were attired with an iron band wrapped tightly around the outside for protection. Over time, people shortened attire to tire, referring to the protective outer ring itself. By the time rubber wheels were invented, again, all around the same time here in the 1800s, the name had already been there and it was waiting for a purpose, right? And what's also interesting is just a footnote on this. Early dictionaries actually suggested the connection with the word being weary or like exhausted, but modern etymologists overwhelmingly favor the connection to the attire explanation. Number 17, the traffic light. The first traffic light, right? Traffic, all right? We're going with this, right? They weren't invented for cars at all. Their roots go back to the railroads. During the 1800s, train companies needed a simple system that engineers could recognize instantly from far away. So they settled on colors that became universal. So thinking about red, right, green, yellow, where did this come from? Well, red meant stop because it had long been associated with danger. Green meant proceed, right? And eventually yellow or amber was added to warn that conditions were changing. When automobiles crowded city streets, now in the early 1900s, engineers borrowed the railroad system and kept it unchanged. So every time you see a red traffic light, you're following the signaling system that first kept trains from crashing into another. 16, bus. Oh my goodness, where'd that come from? This is interesting because bus is just a shortened version of the word omnibus. It's a Latin word meaning for all, for everyone, right? Now you get the idea. In the early 1800s, large horse-drawn vehicles carrying groups of passengers along regular routes through cities. They were called omnibuses because they were transportation for everyone, not just wealthy people. Before long, people naturally shortened omnibus to simply bus, and the nickname stuck. Obviously, today, millions of people take the bus, and it's like, whoa, yeah, this is a Latin word that's over 2,000 years old. Number 15, how about the word van? It's one of the biggest surprises on this list because it's actually a nickname. It comes from the much longer word caravan. And it's funny, if you actually go through, and obviously with bus and van, you say, well, you really start thinking about it and someone tells you, well, you know what, this is a shortened version of another word. Yeah, you can figure it out. But again, we take it for granted. The word caravan originally referred to groups of merchants traveling together across Asia and the Middle East, often with camels carrying goods for protection and trade. When covered horse-drawn wagons began carrying cargo in Britain, they were called caravans because they served a similar purpose. Eventually, people shortened the word to van, and of course, we don't realize, but it's 100 years old. Number 14, how about train? This word existed long before railroads. It comes from the old French word trainer, meaning to pull or drag behind. For centuries, a train referred to anything that followed something else. A train of wagons, a train of packed animals, even a train of servants following a king or queen, right? I think if now that you are hearing this, oh yeah, I've heard that word being used in that way. Well, again, so much of our technology that has evolved, we needed to come up with a word. So when steam locomotives appeared in the early 1800s, pulling a long line of connected cars, people naturally called the whole line a train. The word itself was actually centuries old, but again, the railroad simply gave it a new meaning. Number 13, road. And it's funny, we could go down the complete list of other types of roads, street, lane, boulevard. So that could be its own episode, but let's just go with road. It's far older, the origin of this word, than a lot of people think. It actually comes from the Old English word rod, which originally meant a journey, a ride, traveling on horseback. So originally it did not mean the path itself. Over hundreds of years, the meaning gradually shifted from the act of traveling to the actual route itself. Interesting, right? Some linguistics still kind of disagree with this, but this seems to be the earliest and most accepted understanding. So 12, how about the word traffic? Right on, and so much traffic, right? Where the heck did that come from? Well, we talk about this being lots of cars filling the roads, but the word originally meant trade, commerce, business. It was through Italian and French origins. And it was basically all about the movement of goods rather than the movement of vehicles. As trade increased, obviously it was people, horses, wagons, ships carrying these goods. That became part of the idea. So obviously by the time the car came along, the word had shifted almost entirely to the movement of vehicles themselves. Every time someone complains about traffic, what they're really using a word for was that it once meant just doing business. Number 11, the subway. No, not the sandwich, not the sandwich shop, but underground transportation. And it's actually very simple. It's literal. It combines sub from Latin meaning under and way meaning a path or route. But here's the interesting part. The word wasn't originally used only for underground trains. In the late 1800s, a subway could describe any underground passage, meaning people's tunnels underneath busy streets. When cities like Boston and New York built underground railroads, the name naturally transferred to the trains themselves. So when someone says they're taking the subway, they're technically saying they're taking the underground way. Number 10, the truck. Now, what's interesting about this word is this has an interesting pathway, and linguists are still trying to figure out the exact path, but it started with Latin, and then ultimately it came into English. But there was a few twists along the way. It has nothing to do with engines or highways. Like I said, it comes from the Latin word trocus, meaning wheel, which passed through French as troc or truck. In English, the word truck was used centuries ago for a small wheeled cart or the wheels that carried these heavy loads. When the first cars, the first motorized cargo vehicles, I should say, appeared in the early 1900s, people simply gave the name of the vehicles they were replacing, right? Trucks. So if you're talking about a pickup truck or a tractor trailer today, it actually owes its name to the simple wheeled carts that existed long before automobiles. Number 9, let's go with street. Right? Because when we say, where do you live? We'll say, what street do you live on? We won't say, what lane do you live on? What boulevard do you live on? So where does this come from? Well, it has Roman roots. It comes from the Latin phrase via strata, meaning a paved road or a layered road. Roman engineers built roads by laying down layer after layer of stone, gravel, and sand, creating some of the finest highways of the ancient world. Some are still out there. So this was a big deal. The Latin word strata eventually became the Old English strat, and over time it evolved into our modern word street. So every time we say street, we're using a word that originally described one of Rome's carefully engineered roads. Number 8, the turnpike. The word comes from a physical object that most people have never seen. Hundreds of years ago, many toll roads, in other words, roads that you obviously had to pay to be able to travel on, they were blocked by a long wooden pole covered with iron spikes called a pike. The pole stretched across the road, stopping travelers until they paid their money, until they paid their toll. Once the payment was made, the gatekeeper literally turned the pike to let wagons and horses pass. Roads with these gates became known as turnpikes. The barriers are long gone, but the name remains on highways throughout the United States. That one is absolutely interesting. Number 7, how about the old term, which we obviously don't use today, or we don't certainly travel in today, but how about the coach? And again, you're talking about so many different uses of the words, where you're flying first class or you're flying coach, but ultimately that coach wagon, right? It really is one of the most famous place name stories in our language. The word coach comes from the Hungarian town of Koch. During the 1400s and the 1500s, skilled craftsmen in Koch became famous for building comfortable horse-drawn carriages that were admired throughout Europe. The vehicles became known as coxi, meaning from cox. As the word spread into the other languages, it eventually became the English word coach. What's even more remarkable is that the meaning expanded. Of course, like I referenced, a person who coaches you is someone who carries you towards your goal, just as a coach once carried passengers to their destination. That's why the word applies to both a vehicle and a sports coach and where you sit on a plane. Number 6, garage. Where'd that come from? Well, it actually comes from the French verb garer, and that means to shelter, to protect, put something away safely. So yes, we now have to have a place for automobiles to be, right, sheltered. That French word ultimately was inherited by the English language. So the next time you pull into your garage, you can actually say, I'm going to garage my car. I'm going to shelter. I'm going to protect my car. Number 5, how about a cab? Yeah, you remember we go back to a shortened version of another word? Well, how about that being the shortened version of cabin? It's not the whole story. Cab is actually short for cabriolet. 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 The hardest part of me putting together these podcasts is being able to pronounce these difficult words. Well, anyway, cabriolet is a light two-wheeled horse-drawn carriage that became popular in France during the 1700s. And these small carriages began carrying passengers for hire in cities like London and Paris. People shortened the cabriolet to simply, of course, cab. So when cars replaced horse-drawn vehicles, the name stayed exactly the same. So today's taxi cab carries the name of the carriage that disappeared more than 100 years ago. And yes, we will get to taxi. But number 4, and I have to give a shout out to Jay Leno. I came across a reel where Jay talked about the origin of this word. And I will say this, it blew me away. And I said, I have to do an episode on something like this. The word is dashboard. What the heck? Where did this word come from? No one even bothers to think about it. It's just so routine in terms of our language. But listen to this story. We probably think it has something to do with gauges or speedometers. In reality, it goes back to the days of horses. As horse-drawn wagons traveled along the dirt roads, the horses' hoofs constantly threw up mud, stone, water, and their own excrement backwards towards the driver. So to protect the driver, to protect the passengers, the makers of these carriages installed a wooden board at the front of the carriage to stop or dash away the flying debris. So it became known as a dashboard. It's funny, like one day at some point in the past, someone said, you know what, like we got to call it this. Or again, it probably evolved over time where people just picked up on describing it because no one maybe even thought to come up with a name. Hey, let's just put this board up here. Let's put this protection up here. But when you actually had to go and describe it, you got to attach a name to it. No question, that could be a future episode. There's so many things, and this is always fascinating to me. There's so many things out there in our daily life that we don't have a name for. And it's almost like someone is waiting for somebody to recognize that and give it a name. And then it's obviously going to catch on. But anyway, getting back to dashboard. When automobiles obviously replaced horses, there was no mud being kicked up by their hooves anymore, but the makers of the cars kept the name for the panel in front of the driver. Eventually, it became home to the speedometer, the fuel gauge, and all those instruments that we know, and our smartphones sticking right up there on the dashboard. Number 3, how about a limo? How about the limousine? Well, it doesn't come from the automobile industry at all. It comes from the French region of Limousin. During the Middle Ages, shepherds in that region wore long hooded cloaks that covered their heads and shoulders. When early automobiles, the really luxury ones, were built in the early 1900s, the enclosed passenger compartment reminded some people of those hooded cloaks. Others believe the resemblance was to the covered compartment protecting passengers while the chauffeur remained outside. Either way, the name limousine was borrowed from that French reason, and it quickly became associated with elegance and luxury. A shout out to my wife's cousin, Johnny, who owns a limousine company. Yeah, Johnny, I wonder if you knew where the word came from. So here's a note about this. With all my research, historians agree that the word comes from the Limousin region, although the exact reason for the comparison isn't universally accepted, and that's totally understandable. Number 2, okay, let's get back to taxi. It doesn't come from the idea of taxes or travel. It's actually short, yes, for taxi cab. All right, but still, where did the taxi, how did it get combined with the cab, right? Well, it comes from the taximeter, the device that measured how much a passenger owed for the ride. The word taximeter comes from the French taximetry, which in turn comes from the Latin word taxare, meaning to assess, evaluate, charge, and the Greek word metron, which means measure. In other words, before there was a taxi, there was a machine that figured out the cost of the ride. The vehicle eventually took its name from the meter inside it. Today, we say taxi without realizing that it really referring to the fare meter. Okay, we're up to number 1. How about the odometer? And what's interesting about this, although it doesn't have a great story, its origins, there's a word in here. When you look at the spelling of the word, it doesn't come out in our pronunciation of the word. Well, it's odometer, odometer. It traces its roots back to ancient Greece. It combines the Greek word hodos, meaning road or journey, with metron, which means measure. So quite literally, the odometer is a road measurer. And what's remarkable about odometers themselves, they are ancient. They've been around for a long time. Historians believe that the devices existed more than 2,000 years ago. They were ingenious gear systems that measured how far a wagon had traveled. And here's another fascinating connection. The ending meter comes from, yes, that same Greek word metron, which is why we have the other words like thermometer, speedometer, diameter, perimeter, and even the word metric. Once you use metron, meaning measure, you'll see that it's used in so many different words. How about the meter itself, right? Even though it's pronounced different and it's hidden, the meter is there itself. Friends, I hope you enjoyed this journey down the road, there you go, the street, learning all about the origin of so many transportation words. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We are on Facebook. We are on Twitter. We are on X. You know what? I got to start calling it X. We are on Spotify. We are on YouTube. Soon, there'll be plenty of other places where you can grab us, and soon I will be offering ways that you can support the podcast. But listen, in the meantime, if you could go out and rate, review my podcast, subscribe to the podcast, follow the podcast, any place you can choose. If you don't have an iPhone and you don't have an app, go to the link here in the show notes. You can get my show on buzzsprout.com on any phone, any computer, without having to worry about having a podcast app. Hope that makes sense. And until next time, have fun and keep learning.